Welcome to Haunting Whispers. Tonight, as the rain falls softly, we'll share some true scary stories to help you relax and fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world and the time you are listening. This video, also don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Don't let the man in the raccoon suit inside. Thanks for letting me stay here, I said as I walked through the door. I needed a break from my roommate. He and his girlfriend of the last 6 weeks had gotten into yet another argument, and there were only two possible outcomes. Something would be thrown across the room or hours of fucking. Neither which I wanted to deal with. You practically begged me, TJ replied, a sandy-haired man with green eyes about my age and height. He closed the door and led me into the living room. I don't usually have people over. Well, if I knew you lived like this, I would have asked sooner, I replied, comparing my tiny apartment in a college town to TJ's comfortable home. Judging by the clean brick exterior, spacious front yard, and hardwood floors, he must have lived quite comfortably, considering we had the same job. It's all right. I've lived here since I was a kid, TJ said. I'm going out on a date tonight, but help yourself to anything in the fridge. I have just about every streaming service, so watch whatever. Awesome. I seriously appreciate it, dude. Yeah, I only have one rule, TJ instructed. If you see someone in a raccoon suit outside, don't let him in. What? I chuckled, thinking he was joking, but his serious expression puzzled me. You're messing with me, right? No, not at all. If you see someone in a raccoon suit, don't let him in the house, he replied sternly, grabbing his keys from the coffee table. It hasn't happened in a while, but occasionally he comes around and can be a pain. Okay, that's kind of weird. I know, but if you see a guy dressed in a raccoon suit, do not let him in, TJ reiterated as he headed to the front door. I'll be gone for a few hours, and he's been coming around less and less, so you'll be fine. If I do see him, should I call the cops? No, it's not that serious. Just call or text me. I can shoo him away pretty easily, TJ replied. I don't want to get the cops involved. Okay, I said, still feeling confused. He had to be joking with me, as he gave me a gentle wave and walked out the door, locking it behind him. I looked out the window to see him pull away. It was starting to get dark, as I turned around and settled myself into a nice plush couch. It was nearly 2 hours since TJ had left. I was comfortably settled, watching an HBO documentary about the crazy chimp lady. It was hard to believe someone could be so unhinged. Suddenly, a bright white light filled the window. It looked like a spotlight. As I approached, I saw shadows of trees, bushes, and other objects on the manicured lawn. The light itself felt like one of those used on escaped prisoners in the movies. It was a bit overkill, but something else was out there, and I couldn't believe it. A man dressed in a raccoon suit. The light highlighted the stains, tears, and haggard look of his bodysuit. The head was worse. One ear dangled, the mouth part was covered in various colors. It looked as if the suit had never been washed, or for that matter, taken off. What the hell is this? I said, as its head turned towards me. It waved childishly before walking towards the house. I backed away from the window, my mouth agape. Knock, knock, knock. I stood in the living room, peering down the hall to the foyer. I saw the ragged ear from the small window of the door. It knocked again, more forcefully. I know you are in there, a male voice said, trying to sound cartoonish and cute. I'm just a talking raccoon. Won't you let me come in so we can have an amazing adventure together? What? I yelled in confusion as he began to scratch lightly on the door. I took a couple of steps into the hallway. Listen, you just need to go away. It's been so long since I had an adventure buddy, he screeched as he continued to scratch. I promise we will have lots of fun together, but you have to let me in. I'm not letting you in. Don't you want to have lots of fun? Hell no, I screamed. TJ said not to let you in. TJ? He said, overemphasizing the name as he began pawing at the window. Me and him go so far back. We used to go on adventures together. Oh boy, they were so much fun. Seriously, go away. Boo-hoo, boo-hoo, you're making me sad, he replied, sniffing dramatically. I'm just a talking raccoon who wants to go on adventures, and you're just a big meanie genie. I'm done here, I shouted. Go away, I'm not talking anymore. Fine, he yelled back before a heavy thud shook the door, as if he had kicked it in anger. It became silent as the ears slowly retreated. I stood there silently, waiting to see if anything else would happen, but after a few moments, it was eerily quiet. I returned to the living room, my phone on the coffee table. I considered calling 911, but decided to text TJ instead. Perhaps I'd scared him off? Hesitating, I set my phone down. Sitting nervously on the couch, I clenched my jaw, my stomach churned and my legs jittered. I watched the chimp show, but something gnawed at me. I kept glancing at my phone, torn about calling TJ. Then I heard it, scratching. I grabbed my phone and looked toward the foyer. The sound wasn't from there. It was coming from elsewhere in the house. My mind raced as I followed the sound down a hallway with 3 doors. The scratching grew more frantic. I passed the first door on the right, gently opening it to reveal a spotless bathroom. The sound didn't originate there. I turned to the left, opening the door slowly as the scratching intensified. The room was dark. I fumbled for the light switch, finding it eventually. The bedroom was immaculate. Stepping back out, I heard a voice. "Hello, new friend." I walked over to the door, pushing it open to reveal a dark room with a silhouette in the window. I found the light switch and turned it on. He stood outside looking at me, but that wasn't what shocked me. Inside the room, crude drawings littered the walls. Finger paints and crayon scribbles showing 2 figures. One with yellow hair and the other a raccoon standing on 2 legs. Some showed them holding hands, smiling, or playing childish games. Others, more disturbing, showed the boy frowning and the raccoon crying. "See, me and TJ, the 2 of us go way back," he chatted. "We were the best of best friends, okay? Now me and you can be best friends," he added, tapping gently on the window. "Now can I please come in? Oh, pretty please?" "No," TJ said, "do not let you in." "You don't know TJ like I do," he prodded. "He used to be such a fun boy, but then he changed. Something happened to him. You're not coming into the house. Now go away." He became a cruel, cruel boy, and my adventure buddy became so dark, he continued, while waving his hand around the window. "You see it here in this room, don't you?" "I don't care," I insisted as he put down his hand, suddenly becoming silent for a moment. Even with the raccoon head, I could feel his stare boring right through me, leaving my stomach in knots. "He will hurt you like he hurt me," he replied, his voice with a light tremble. "But if you let me in, I won't let anyone, especially TJ, hurt my new best friend." My mind raced, the absurdity of it all impossible. This had to be some sick joke, and there was only one person who would do something like this. "All right, cut the crap," I smirked. "I'll give it to you. This is probably a funny prank, TJ." "I'm not TJ. I am a talking raccoon." "Talking raccoons don't exist. You're just a weird prankster in a costume." He stood there, outside in the wind. For a moment, he lifted his fake paw and began rubbing his chin. I could hear him sigh as he conceded, still in his cartoonish voice. "All right, you caught me. Good job. You passed the friendship test." I let out a sigh of relief. "All right, I'm glad we can end this game. Honestly, it was starting to freak me out." "Yeah, sorry, sometimes I get a little carried away," he chuckled, turning his head toward the front door. "I'll see you inside, I guess." "Can you take off the suit? I mean, it actually does sort of give me the creeps." "What?" he replied, turning his head back to me. "Take off the head part at least," I said as I stepped a little closer to the window. He started to breathe heavily, but stood there without saying a word. I began to feel a little uneasy again, starting to doubt myself. "Come on, take it off, and you can come inside." "But I can't do that." "All right, there's one way to settle this then," I said, thinking of a solution to rest any doubt. I pulled up my phone and called TJ's number. The phone began to ring as we stood in a staring contest. "What are you doing?" "I'm calling you, TJ." No, don't do that. My phone is in the treehouse." "What?" "Hello." I heard TJ's voice over the phone. My eyes widened and I began to panic. Suddenly, the man in the raccoon suit started to scratch at the window menacingly, tearing the screen. "You're not the fucking raccoon?" I shouted loudly over the phone. "What? Of course I'm not. Is he there? Seriously?" TJ answered. "Yes, he told me he was you. Just stay inside the house. I'm on my way back," TJ replied before hanging up. He noticed that I was no longer on the phone and bolted away from the window as I ran out of the room. I could hear a doorknob rattling from somewhere as I ran back to the foyer area to see him trying to open it. TJ's on his way. No, he cried, pounding on the door. I feared he might break in and didn't know what he was capable of. Let me in. He'll be home soon. The begging and banging stopped, but the silence was brief. I heard a crash and ran through the house, searching for him. The sounds grew more violent, and I thought he was trying to break in, but I found no sign of him inside the house. Then I heard glass shattering. The raccoon man had a rock and was smashing my car windows. Glass flew everywhere as he swung his furry arm. He stopped, and I felt relieved until I saw something worse. A small red gas can, labeled with the word lawnmower. He was pouring gasoline inside. No, 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 I shouted as he lit a grill lighter. I darted to the front door, unlocked it, and ran outside. Flames erupted from my car's shattered windows. I stopped as the fire grew, engulfing the interior. Then I heard a door slam. He was inside. Oh crap, I muttered. I heard tires squealing and saw headlights approaching. I quickly ran out of the way as TJ burst out. Where is he? I think he went inside. TJ stormed towards his house, and I followed meekly. He pushed the door open aggressively. Don't make me do it, he shouted. I lingered in the foyer, still fearful and not knowing what would transpire. TJ, where is he? I yelled as I heard someone running in the living room. I cautiously approached and saw TJ and the raccoon man facing each other. TJ held a broom. Raccoons live outside. Shoo! TJ taunted, swinging the broom wildly. A loud crack echoed as the broom hit the man. Get out of here now. No, I won. I finally won, the man shouted, blocking his face. I won. You can't shoo me anymore. I told you raccoons live outside, TJ insisted, hitting him again. TJ, I'm calling the cops, I barked, pulling out my phone. But then I saw him dive at TJ, tackling him to the ground. They rolled around, knocking over the coffee table. The raccoon costume's head came off. He looked like TJ, except his hair was long and tangled, with a beard. His skin covered in dried mud and God knows what else, and his eyes wide with frenzy. I won. It's been 5 years, he snarled. He stood up, holding the broken broom handle. Now it's your turn to be the raccoon and live outside. I watched as he shoved the raccoon head onto TJ. I wasn't sure if I should call the cops. I walked outside and looked at my burning car, wondering how I was going to get home. But just when you thought that was the worst thing that could happen, something even darker was waiting to be uncovered. I met my soulmate in Shanghai. I wish I hadn't. I arrived in Shanghai under a haze of jet lag and grief. The city's chaotic energy did little to ease the numbness that had settled in my bones. I hadn't returned to China since I was a child, and even then, it was a fleeting visit, a brief encounter with distant relatives I never thought I'd see again. Now, I was back to settle in a state that felt more like a burden than a gift. The death of my uncle, a man I barely knew, had summoned me here. I had only vague memories of him from my childhood, blurry images of a quiet man standing at the edge of family gatherings. When I was contacted by the lawyer handling his estate, the news didn't hit me with the shock one might expect. Instead, it felt like a summons, an obligation to a man whose life had been a mystery to me. Still, I accepted out of duty more than curiosity, and now found myself in the heart of a city that thrived on life, while I felt nothing but the weight of death. After dealing with the legal formalities, I wandered through the neon-lit streets, the skyscrapers towering above me, casting long shadows that seemed to reach out like fingers in the night. The lawyer had been distant, dismissive even, handing me the keys to the old family property with little more than a formal nod. It's all in your hands now, he had said, and the words echoed in my mind, heavy with implication. What did he mean by that? I found myself by the river, watching the lights from the bund reflect on the water. The city hummed with life around me, but it felt as though I was drifting, disconnected, a stranger in my own family's history. That's when I saw him. He stood casually by the railing, his silhouette illuminated by the glow of the skyline. There was something about him that caught my attention immediately. Perhaps it was the way he stood, confident yet reserved, or the way his eyes flickered toward me before I had even realized I was staring. He didn't belong to the crowd, that much was clear. He seemed separate, like a fragment of the night itself. Beautiful night, isn't it? His voice was smooth, almost melodic, breaking through the ambient noise of the city. There was a warmth in his tone that made the hairs on the back of my neck rise, an unsettling, magnetic pull. I hesitated for a moment before responding. "It is," I said softly, unsure why I was suddenly nervous. His gaze was intense, almost too intense, but there was an undeniable charm in his smile. I found myself drawn to him, feeling a spark of something I hadn't felt since I'd arrived. A connection in a place that had so far made me feel utterly alone. "Lay," he introduced himself, holding out a hand. His grip was firm but cold, a subtle chill that lingered even after he released it. We fell into an easy conversation as we walked along the riverside, the lights of the city shimmering on the surface of the water beside us. Lay was charismatic, attentive in a way that made me forget, if only for a moment, why I was even in Shanghai. He asked about me, about my life, but deflected when I asked about his. Mysterious, I thought. Maybe a little too mysterious, but I was intrigued. After all, what harm was there in a little distraction from the heaviness of death? By the time we parted ways, exchanging numbers, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time since I'd arrived, I wasn't alone. But as I made my way back to the sleek, modern apartment I was renting, I couldn't shake the feeling that Lay had been watching me long before I had noticed him. The following days passed in a blur of paperwork and phone calls. The estate had more complications than I expected. Deeds, assets, and family relics I had never heard of. Each conversation with the lawyer brought new surprises, like my uncle's ownership of an old house tucked away in one of Shanghai's forgotten districts. The thought of going there alone made me uneasy, so I kept putting it off. Something about the way the lawyer had brushed off questions about the house felt wrong, as though he didn't want to talk about it. But in between the stress, there was Lay. We had been seeing each other almost every day. Dinners, late-night walks, and quiet conversations in quiet cafes. It was easy to get lost in his charm, his ease of conversation, the way he seemed to understand everything without me having to explain. Still, I couldn't help but feel there was something he wasn't telling me, something just beneath the surface. He would smile, but sometimes the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. One night, after a particularly grueling day dealing with the estate, Lay invited me to his apartment. The invitation felt natural, a progression in what had quickly become a relationship. His apartment was on the outskirts of the city, in a high-rise that seemed out of place among the old neighborhoods it towered over. The interior was modern, sleek, and spotless, yet it felt sterile. There were no personal touches, no photos or signs of a life lived. Just perfect, polished surfaces. "You must be exhausted," Lay said as he poured me a glass of wine. I nodded, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. The warmth of the wine helped a little, but the coldness of the apartment clung to me. As we sat together on his pristine couch, I couldn't help but notice how still he was. Too still. His movements, usually smooth and graceful, now seemed rehearsed, like each gesture was part of an intricate performance. And then, for the briefest moment, I saw it. A crack. It was small, barely noticeable, but it ran along the edge of his jawline. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but when I blinked, it was gone, as if it had never been there. My breath hitched in my throat. I wanted to ask him, to say something, but the words died before they left my lips. I stared at my wine glass instead, forcing myself to relax, to ignore what I had just seen. "Is something wrong?" Lay's voice cut through my thoughts, soft but probing. I shook my head quickly, plastering on a smile. "No, I'm just tired." He watched me for a moment, his dark eyes unreadable, before nodding. "Of course, it's been a long week for you." His hand touched mine, cold against my skin, and for a second I could swear I felt that same crack beneath his fingers. A chill raced through me, but I said nothing. The days that followed should have felt normal, but nothing did. My work with the estate became an afterthought, replaced by an obsession I couldn't shake. Lay. Something about him gnawed at my mind, filling every quiet moment with unease. I kept replaying that night in his apartment, convincing myself that the crack I'd seen was just a trick of my exhausted mind. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the worse the feeling became. It wasn't just that. He was changing, or at least my perception of him was. Small things, barely noticeable at first. His voice would sometimes sound too smooth, almost unnatural. His movements, always so graceful, seemed too deliberate, like they were mimicked rather than natural. And the dreams. They started shortly after that night in his apartment. In the first dream, I was standing at the foot of Lay's bed. He was lying there, asleep, but something was wrong. His face was smooth and flawless as always, but then, slowly, the skin began to peel away. It didn't bleed, and there was no pain, just layers of flesh slipping off, revealing something hideous underneath. A twisted, contorted face with hollow eyes that stared back at me. I tried to scream, but no sound came. I woke in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the sheets tangled around me. It was just a dream, I told myself, over and over again. The next few days passed in a blur of paranoia. Every time I met with Lay, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me too closely, studying me. And the crack I'd seen that night? It started appearing more often. Sometimes it was on his jaw, sometimes his hands. Each time it would disappear before I could get a second look. But I knew it wasn't just my imagination. One afternoon, I decided it was finally time to visit my uncle's old house. The place had been left untouched for years, gathering dust and sinking into disrepair. The lawyer's vague descriptions and dismissiveness had only fueled my curiosity. I had been avoiding it, reluctant to confront whatever history might be buried there. But the weight of uncertainty was starting to suffocate me. The house stood at the end of a narrow street, hidden among overgrown trees and faded stone walls. It was a stark contrast to the sleek, modern apartment I had been staying in. Everything about this place felt old, forgotten, like it belonged to a different era altogether. I pushed open the creaking door, a rush of stale air hitting me as I stepped inside. I spent hours going through piles of papers, yellowed books, and fading family mementos. My uncle's life was scattered across the rooms, half forgotten, and for a while it felt like I was drowning in someone else's memories. The deeper I dug, the more disoriented I became. Dusty photographs, letters written in fading ink, items that seemed to have no connection to me at all. At the bottom of a worn leather box, buried beneath stacks of old papers, was an old photograph. The paper was fragile, worn around the edges, but it was the faces in the picture that sent a chill through me. I stared at the image, two men standing side by side. One of them I recognized immediately as my great-uncle, though he was much younger in the picture. But it was the man beside him that made my skin crawl. It was Lay. The photograph had to be at least 60 years old, judging by the way the men were dressed. Yet Lay looked exactly the same as he did now. His face was unchanged, smooth, flawless, and unaged. The realization hit me like a blow to the chest, my hands trembling as I held the picture closer to examine it. No one could look the same after all this time. I flipped the photograph over, hoping for some explanation, but the back was blank. No dates, no names, nothing that could tell me who these men were to each other or why this picture existed. A wave of nausea rolled through me. It wasn't just Lay's unnerving perfection anymore. There was something far darker at play here. Something that had been lurking in the shadows of my family long before I arrived in Shanghai. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, and I suddenly had the overwhelming urge to leave. I shoved the photograph into my bag and rushed out of the house, not bothering to lock the door behind me. As I walked back to the apartment, the city's noise became distant, muffled by the thoughts crashing through my mind. Lay wasn't human. He couldn't be. The photograph was proof that he had existed far longer than any normal person should. But why? And why was he here now in my life? The questions spun wildly in my head, but no answers came. I felt a growing sense of dread, as if the world around me was closing in. That night, I lay awake in bed, the photograph resting on the table beside me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Lay's face, his perfect, unchanging face, and the crack I had seen on his skin. The next morning, I woke up feeling heavy, as though the weight of the photograph had settled deep inside my chest, squeezing my lung. I hadn't slept well. Every creak in the apartment made me bolt upright, expecting to find Lay standing in the shadows, watching me. The rational part of my brain kept trying to soothe me, to tell me that I was overreacting, but the photograph on the table beside me said otherwise. I couldn't just ignore it. I needed answers, but I wasn't sure how to get them. Who could I even trust at this point? I decided to meet Lay later that day. I wasn't ready to confront him, not yet, but I needed to see him. I needed to figure out if there was any part of this man that was still normal, still human. Maybe I could find a crack in the facade that would explain all of this. Or maybe I was walking straight into a trap. When he greeted me outside a cafe, his smile was just as flawless as it always had been. But now, I couldn't unsee the truth. I couldn't shake the image of the photograph, the knowledge that he had been standing beside my great-uncle, looking exactly the same as he did now. How long had he been hiding this? And why? "You seem distant today," Lay said, his eyes narrowing slightly as we sat down. "Is everything all right?" I forced a smile, fighting the growing panic in my chest. "Yeah, just didn't sleep too well last night." He studied me carefully, too carefully, as if he knew I was hiding something. There was something in his gaze that I hadn't noticed before, something calculating and cold. I could feel my pulse racing, the walls of the cafe closing in around me. I needed to leave, but before I could excuse myself, Lay's hand reached across the table, resting lightly on mine. His touch, once so warm and reassuring, now felt like ice. "You've been different lately," he said, his voice too smooth, too controlled, distracted. I swallowed hard, trying to pull my hand away, but his grip tightened. I yanked my hand free, my heart pounding in my chest. I need to go." Lay's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes that sent a shiver down my spine. He knew. He knew I had seen something, and now there was no going back. I left the cafe in a rush, not daring to look back. My hands were trembling as I hurried down the street, my mind racing. I needed to figure out what I was dealing with, but who could help me? The police? No, they'd think I was insane. My friends? They were thousands of miles away, and besides, they wouldn't understand. No one would, except maybe the lawyer. The thought hit me like a lightning bolt. He had been so dismissive, so eager to hand off my uncle's estate and wash his hands of it. But now that I thought about it, there had been something strange about the way he avoided answering my questions about my family's past. Maybe he knew more than he let on. Maybe he could help me understand what was happening. I grabbed my phone and dialed his number, my fingers shaking as I pressed it to my ear. "Hello?" His voice crackled through the line, sharp and impatient. "It's me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need to talk to you. It's about my uncle. Something really strange is going on." There was a pause on the other end, longer than I expected. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, more measured. "Meet me at my office. We'll talk." I hung up, a knot of anxiety twisting in my gut. The way he had said it, "we'll talk," felt loaded with meaning. He knew something. I could feel it. The lawyer's office was tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, the kind of place you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. The building was unremarkable, with peeling paint and a small sign that looked like it hadn't been changed in years. I wasn't sure why I had come here, but my instincts told me this was my only lead. If anyone could give me answers about my uncle's strange past, it would be Mr. Feng. I stepped inside, the musty smell of old paper and dust greeting me. He sat behind his desk, his sharp eyes flicking up from a stack of documents as I entered. "I thought you were done with the estate," he muttered, setting his papers aside. I shook my head, suddenly unsure how to begin. "It's not about the estate. I've found something strange." He leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to curiosity. "Go on." I hesitated, pulling the photograph from my bag and sliding it across the desk. He glanced at it, his brow furrowing as he examined the faded image of my great-uncle and Lay standing together, decades ago. "This photo, it's old," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But the man in it, he hasn't aged. That's Lay, the same man I've been seeing for the past few weeks. He looks exactly the same." Mr. Feng's face paled as his fingers tightened around the photograph. He stared at it for a long moment, then placed it carefully on the desk, his hands trembling slightly. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice quieter now, tinged with something I couldn't quite place. "Fear, maybe?" "In my uncle's house," I replied. "I was going through his things, and I don't know. I can't explain it, but something about Lay. There's something wrong with him." He sighed heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. He seemed older now, more worn down than when I had first met him. "I had hoped this wouldn't happen," he muttered to himself. Then, louder, Your uncle was involved in something he didn't want to talk about. I leaned forward. What do you mean? What was he involved in? He stood up, pacing behind his desk. Your family has been in Shanghai for generations. There are old stories, legends about strange things happening to people connected to your bloodline. Disappearances, sightings, people aging too quickly or not at all. I thought it was just nonsense, superstitions passed down through the years. But when I saw your uncle's estate and how quickly he wanted it all handled, I suspected something else. He paused, glancing at the photograph again. But this is proof. My mouth went dry. Proof of what? Proof that whatever your uncle was trying to escape has come back, and now it's after you. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I shook my head, trying to process what he was saying. He's not human, is he? Mr. Feng didn't answer right away. He seemed to struggle with the words, finally saying, There's an old legend, one that speaks of creatures that can take the form of humans. They use their appearance to deceive, to lure people in. These creatures, these painted skin demons, have been around for centuries, feeding on those they can trap. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, my vision blurring as the reality of what he was saying set in. And you think Lei is one of them? He nodded grimly. I'm almost certain. Your uncle tried to run from this, but he wasn't fast enough. You need to leave Shanghai. Now. I stood up, my legs shaky. But how do I stop him? How do I get away? He looked at me with pity in his eyes. I don't know if you can, but you need to try. I left Mr. Feng's office with a cold knot of fear in my stomach. The streets outside were busy as always, but everything felt distant, muffled, like I was moving through a dream I couldn't wake up from. The world around me no longer felt real. Nothing did. My mind raced as I hurried back to my apartment. Mr. Feng's words echoed in my head, each one tightening the noose of dread around my chest. Painted skin demon. The idea sounded ridiculous. Something pulled straight out of a horror movie. But the photograph lay. I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. I had seen it with my own eyes. I had felt it in my gut. Lei wasn't human, and now I was part of whatever dark game he was playing. I fumbled with the keys to my apartment, my hands shaking as I let myself inside. The door slammed shut behind me, and I locked it quickly, as if the flimsy bolt could keep something like him out. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. I moved to the window, pulling the curtains shut, trying to block out the city beyond. For the first time since I'd arrived in Shanghai, I felt trapped, cornered by something I didn't understand. I needed to leave. Mr. Feng was right. There was no point in trying to confront Lei. I had to get as far away from him as possible. My flight back to the United States wasn't scheduled for another week, but I couldn't wait that long. I had to find a way out now. I packed quickly, throwing my belongings into my suitcase with shaking hands. As I zipped up the bag, my phone buzzed on the table. The screen lit up with a message from Lei. Dinner tonight? I miss you. My heart lurched in my chest. The words were innocent, casual even, but now they sent a jolt of terror through me. He knew. He had to know. Why else would he reach out now after everything? I stared at the message, my hands cold and clammy, before forcing myself to respond. I'm not feeling well. Maybe another time. I set the phone down and took a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic rhythm of my heartbeat. I didn't have much time. I needed to book a flight, get out of the apartment, and disappear before Lei realized what I was doing. I was about to start searching for flights when the phone buzzed again. Another message. I can come over. Take care of you. I dropped the phone, my pulse spiking. He was too close, too eager. I had to move. Now. I grabbed my suitcase and darted toward the door. Just as I reached for the handle, there was a knock. 3 sharp raps echoed through the apartment like a death knell. Hey, it's me. Lei's voice. I stumbled back from the door, my mind spinning. How had he gotten here so fast? I hadn't even told him where I lived, had I? Panic surged through me as the knocking came again, louder this time. Are you in there? Lei's voice was smooth, calm, but there was an edge to it now, something that made my skin crawl. You didn't answer my message. I clutched my suitcase, my back pressed against the far wall of the apartment. I could hear him moving outside the door, his footsteps slow, deliberate, like he was waiting for something. I know you're in there, he said softly, almost playfully now. Don't you want to see me? I didn't respond. I couldn't. Every instinct in my body was screaming for me to stay silent, to keep as far away from the door as possible. But I knew I couldn't stay here. I had to get out. My eyes darted around the apartment, searching for an escape. The fire escape. My window led to the back of the building, where the fire escape ladder could take me down to the alley below. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only chance I had. I moved as quietly as I could, tiptoeing toward the window. I slid it open slowly, wincing at the faint creak of the hinges. Just as I was about to climb out, my phone buzzed again. Another message. "Where do you think you're going?" My stomach twisted. I looked down at the phone in horror. There was no way he could have known. Unless he could see me. I didn't have time to think. I clambered out the window, gripping the cold metal of the fire escape as I hurried down the ladder, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The alley was dark and narrow, the shadows thick between the buildings. I hit the ground running, my suitcase dragging behind me as I raced toward the street. I didn't know where I was going. All I knew was that I needed to get away. The city felt like a maze, the streets twisting and turning, leading me nowhere. My mind was racing, a jumble of fear and panic that blurred the world around me. I had no plan, no clear destination. I just kept running, hoping that the distance would be enough to keep him away. But it wasn't long before I realized that something was wrong. No matter how far I ran, no matter how many streets I crossed, I couldn't shake the feeling that Lei was still close. Too close. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I thought I saw him, just a flicker of movement in the crowd, a face too familiar among the strangers passing by. I ducked into a nearby cafe, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. I couldn't keep running like this. I needed to get out of Shanghai, and fast. I couldn't just sit here, waiting for him to find me. I grabbed my phone and started scrolling through flights. There was a late-night flight leaving for the United States in a few hours. It was expensive, but I didn't care. I booked it without thinking, my hands trembling as I entered my payment details. For a moment, I allowed myself to exhale, feeling the tension in my body loosen just a little. The cafe was quiet, a small bubble of normalcy amid the chaos that had consumed my life. The low hum of conversations and the clinking of coffee cups gave me a false sense of comfort. I looked around, no sign of Lei. He wasn't here, not now. I slid further into the booth, my legs trembling beneath the table. The adrenaline that had been keeping me on my feet for hours was starting to wear off, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. I had barely slept in days, and now that I was sitting still, the weight of everything was crashing down on me. My body was screaming for rest, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. Every nerve in my body told me to stay alert, to keep moving, but I couldn't anymore. Just for a moment, I told myself. Just a moment to close my eyes and breathe. I must have only intended to rest for a minute or two, but exhaustion claimed me completely. I don't know how long I had been asleep, maybe an hour, maybe less, but when I woke, the cafe felt different. The air was thick, stifling, and there was a strange silence that hung heavy in the room. I was still winking the sleep away when suddenly, the screen lit up with a new message. "You can't hide from me." A cold wave of terror crashed over me, snapping me out of my drowsy haze. I had fallen asleep. I had let my guard down, and now he was here, or close. I shoved my phone into my bag and bolted for the door. I burst onto the street, my pulse racing as I frantically scanned the crowd for any sign of Lei. Every shadow, every figure felt like a threat, like he was lurking just out of view. I couldn't see him, but I knew he was there, watching, waiting. I waved down the first taxi I saw, nearly tripping over myself as I climbed into the back seat. The driver barely glanced at me as I gave him the address for the airport, my voice shaky and strained. He pulled away from the curb, the hum of the engine a faint comfort as the city began to blur past the windows. I gripped the edge of the seat, trying to steady my breathing. The flight was booked, and I had a few hours left to make it to the airport. All I had to do was get on that plane. Once I was in the air, once I left Shanghai, I'd be free. At least that's what I told myself. But the uneasy feeling that had settled in the pit of my stomach refused to fade. Lei had found me so easily before. How had he known I was in the cafe? How had he always been one step ahead? The taxi began slowing down. I glanced up and I saw a pair of red taillights ahead, blinking in the dark. There was a construction vehicle blocking the road, a detour sign flashing in the dim light. The driver sighed, pulling the car to a stop. "Looks like we'll have to take a different route," he muttered, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. I nodded, but something felt off. The street was too quiet, the shadows too thick. I couldn't shake the feeling that Lei was still close, no matter how fast I tried to escape. Suddenly, a loud bang shattered the silence. I gasped as the passenger window exploded inward, glass raining down like shards of ice. My heart seized in my chest as I turned to see him. Lei, his hand gripping the edge of the broken window, his dark eyes locking onto mine. He moved too fast, too silent, like a predator that had been lurking in the shadows all along. His hand lunged through the window, reaching for me with terrifying speed. His fingers grazed my arm, cold and unyielding. I jerked back, my heart hammering in my throat, but his grip was like iron, tightening around my wrist. He pulled harder, his strength inhuman, dragging me toward the shattered window, shards of glass cutting into my skin. "You're not leaving," he growled, his voice low and menacing, sending a chill down my spine. "You'll never leave me." The driver let out a panicked shout, and the car lurched forward with a screech of tires. The sudden momentum ripped Lei's grip from my wrist and sent him crashing to the ground with brutal force. The driver swore loudly, the air thick with panic. I dared a glance over my shoulder, terrified of what I might see. In the middle of the road, Lei rose slowly to his feet, his movements unnaturally fluid. His head tilted slightly, his eyes locked on the taxi, and a twisted smile crept across his face. "Go, please," I screamed, my voice cracking as I whipped back toward the driver. The driver, pale and wide-eyed, nodded frantically, slamming his foot down on the gas pedal. The moment the taxi pulled up to the airport, a wave of relief washed over me. I was almost there, just a few steps away from leaving Shanghai, from leaving Lei behind. The terminal was busy, packed with travelers hurrying to their gates, dragging luggage and speaking in rapid-fire conversations that blurred together. It was all so normal, so ordinary, that for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope. I just had to make it through. Dragging my suitcase behind me, I made my way through the throngs of people. I glanced at the departures board, my eyes darting to the flight that would take me back to Houston. I made my way directly to the boarding gate, and just nearby, I spotted a restroom. Needing a moment to collect myself, I headed into the women's restroom. Eager for a brief escape before boarding, the room was silent and empty, the cold fluorescent lights flickering overhead. Setting my bag down, I splashed cold water on my face, hoping to wash away the fear that clung to me like a shadow. For a moment, I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. Just a few more minutes. I'll be in the air, away from all of this. But when I opened my eyes, everything changed. Standing behind me in the mirror, Lei's reflection filled the space just inches away. His eyes, those cold, dark eyes, burned with something far more sinister than before. My heart seized in my chest as I spun around, but before I could scream, he lunged at me, his hand wrapping around my throat. My breath hitched as his cold fingers closed tightly, squeezing the air from my lungs. Before I could fight back, he lifted me off the ground as if I weighed nothing, his hand tightening around my neck. My feet dangled uselessly in the air, kicking wildly as panic flooded through me. The cold, tiled floor below seemed to stretch away, the world blurring around the edges of my vision. I clawed at his hand, my nails digging into his skin, but it didn't matter. His grip didn't loosen. He held me effortlessly, his dark eyes watching me with that same eerie calm, as if this were all part of some twisted game. My chest burned, desperate for air. I gasped, but nothing came. My pulse pounded in my ears, and black spots danced at the corners of my vision. The pressure on my throat was unbearable. Every second, it grew tighter, crushing me from the inside out. He leaned in closer, his voice a low, mocking whisper. "You really thought you could get away from me?" My mind raced, desperate for a way out, for anything that could save me. But the bathroom was empty, and his grip was relentless. Then, the door swung open. A security guard stepped inside, his expression turning to confusion as he saw Lei in the women's restroom. "Hey," he called out, stepping forward. "Let go of her." Lei didn't even flinch. His grip loosened on my neck for just a second, but it was enough for me to gasp for air, my body shaking with terror. The guard reached for Lei, trying to pull him away from me, but Lay moved too quickly. He turned on the guard, shoving him backward with a force that sent him crashing to the floor. They struggled, the guard trying to fight back, but Lay was too strong, too fast. Lay grabbed the guard by the collar and slammed him against the wall with a brutal strength I hadn't fully understood until now. But in that moment, I saw my chance. Without thinking, I ran toward the door, my legs trembling beneath me. I pushed it open and stumbled out into the busy terminal, gasping for air as I ran toward the gate. The terminal was crowded, a sea of people rushing toward their gates. I ducked into the flow of bodies, weaving through the mass of travelers. I could still hear the sounds of the struggle behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I had to reach the gate. I had to get on that plane. I could feel Lay's presence behind me, even if he wasn't there. His voice still echoed in my mind, his hands still wrapped around my throat. When I reached the gate, it was already boarding. The crowd of passengers offered me the cover I needed. I merged into the line, keeping my head down, my hands shaking as I handed my ticket to the agent. She smiled and waved me through, unaware of the terror that had been stalking me for days. I stepped onto the plane, the cool, pressurized air hitting me like a wave. Rows of seats stretched out in front of me, passengers already settled, tucking bags into overhead compartments and chatting quietly. I moved through the aisle like a ghost, my mind still racing, scanning every face for any sign of Lay. But he wasn't here. Not anymore. I found my seat near the back of the plane, squeezing past a woman engrossed in her book, her headphones firmly in place. I sank into the window seat, my hands shaking as I buckled the seatbelt. The hum of the engines below was a faint comfort, something steady in the chaos. The pit in my stomach tightened as the plane gathered speed, racing faster and faster down the runway. My fingers gripped the armrests, the tension rising with every passing second. I stared out the window, watching as the ground blurred beneath us, the airport shrinking away as the nose of the plane lifted into the sky. I had escaped, or so I thought. As I sat there, staring out the window, I felt a strange tingling in my hand. I looked down, and my blood froze. There, on the inside of my palm, was a mark, faint, barely visible, but undeniably there. A thin crack, like the ones I had seen on Lay's skin, ran across the surface of my hand. It was as if a part of him had stayed with me, even now, even after I had escaped. I clenched my fist, trying to ignore the chill creeping up my spine. I had made it onto the plane. I was leaving Shanghai. But I knew deep down that I hadn't truly escaped him. I could still feel his presence, watching, waiting. Little did they know that was only the beginning. The real nightmare had yet to come. Run like hell. My mother was a gold digger. I was never under any illusions about that. I never knew who my father was. She always hinted that he had been a cultured man from a rich family and that he had simply run out on her when she got pregnant with me, never to be seen again. I was a handsome, precocious boy, not to toot my own horn too much, and I knew from a pretty young age that she used me as a prop to draw wealthy, older men closer to her. The last time this happened was when I was 14, and she met a man named Nick. Nick was younger and richer, I believe, than any other guy she had gotten her hooks into. He drove a black Benz and wore expensive-looking slacks with button-down shirts that fit perfectly. Handsome devil, too. Mom never got specific about what he did. He's a speculator, she'd say. Nick and I would sit and talk for a long time while he waited for my mom to get ready to go out. And to be honest, I really loved these conversations. We talked about literature we both liked, like The Telltale Heart and Neuromancer. Once I tried to talk to him about Kurt Vonnegut, but he just got furious and left before my mom was even finished putting her makeup on. He helped me with my algebra homework, and we'd talk about music together, although there we didn't have much in common. He just kept complaining. Everything I liked sounded too black. To impress Nick, who I supposed must have been weirdly religious, my mom insisted I start going to Sunday school and reading the Bible. One thing I learned was that guys who fall for gold diggers always have one thing really weird about them or wrong with them. So I presumed Nick must have been a holy roller, which would also explain why he got so pissy about a cynical, atheist humanist like Vonnegut. I had a good memory and good brain, and there was really not very much to Christianity, as far as I could tell. I memorized the Apostles' Creed and the Lord's Prayer and Psalm 22 and some Bible verses, and I learned to begin prayers with Dear God and end with In Jesus' name. And that as long as you got the form right, the middle part didn't matter much because God was going to do pretty much what he wanted anyway. I prayed every night. It was a soothing thing to do after brushing my teeth, and I said the Lord's Prayer a lot in my head. Nick started to say to my mom and to me when she wasn't around that I was such a smart and sweet boy, I must surely be one of God's favorites already. Really loves a scholar too, he does, he'd say. And he always had a weakness for the pretty ones. We would do fun things sometimes without my mother around. He had fantastic season tickets to the bowls, and he'd help me dress up and take me to French restaurants and steakhouses, and he taught me to eat sushi with chopsticks. Because schoolwork was so easy for me, he even started to teach me Latin from a very old book he had with a black cover festooned with gold stars and spirals and other symbols. He said that people didn't realize how useful Latin still could be, and that I would especially need it. And see, that last part seemed weird. The fixation on Latin was weird. Even as a 14-year-old, that triggered some alarm bells. That and the way Nick smelled if you got close to him. Under his sandalwood cologne, I could smell traces of an older, more noxious smell. I asked my mother once if she knew why her boyfriend always smelled a little like rotten eggs. And first she got mad, then quickly changed the subject. So in the weeks leading up to my 15th birthday, she started hinting that she had a special gift for me. She said that Nick and I were going to take a trip together, and that when we came back, we would all be a family. I overheard them talking one night after I'd gone to bed. She said, "But can't you just transfer it or something? Why does it have to be complicated?" And he said, "There are ways these things have to be done. Old ways. You know that. We have talked about it ad nauseum." "Well, do I have to be there for it?" "Yes," he said in a voice so scary it kept ringing in my head as I lay sleepless all night. We were all sitting in our living room on my birthday, a hot day in April. The living room was hotter than usual, even though the AC was on full blast. Nick and my mother kept giving each other conspiratorial glances, and Nick said things like, "Just look at our boy. Surely one of God's favorites by now. God must value him greatly." This kind of talk had always made me uncomfortable, but up until recently I assumed it was just effusive talk from a religious nut. Today they were both eager and careless. After they offered me a glass of ginger ale, which I pretended to drink, and then went in the bathroom and spit out, they got even more careless. I saw the burlap sack full of what I was sure were gold coins next to Nick's chair, and I saw the way my mother kept looking at the bag, dollar signs in her eyes. There was a very old-looking piece of parchment on the table beside my mother, and I was pretty sure I knew what that was. I played a joke on them. I pretended I had really drunk the ginger ale and that I was getting weirdly tired and dizzy. I stood up and then sat right back down hard and fluttered my eyes. Prick his finger now. Prick his finger and use it to sign the pact. Do it now. Nick was completely done pretending now. The horns he usually covered carefully with his thick, dark hair were jutting up from his head, and his eyes were glowing a feverish red color. He kicked off his shoes and put his cloven feet on the floor and stood up, letting his tail slide out of his pants. He was grinning. Yes, it really kills God to lose one like this. And then I was off. Even though I had figured out what was going on, I didn't have any particularly cunning plan. I just pretended I was drugged and helpless, and then, as my mother got close to me to prick my finger, I kicked her as hard as I could and ran the hell out the door while she yelped in pain. I heard a sound all the way down the hallway just before I threw the door open and kept running. That reminded me of a wounded lion. Nick, I assumed. He didn't chase me, not right away. Neither of them did. I had the feeling that even if Nick didn't get the soul he had come to take, he did take a soul that day. I never heard from my mother again. In the years since, I have done pretty well. The early teen years were rough. I ended up in foster care. But I was white, smart, good-looking, and did well in school. College was a lot of fun. I kept studying. Latin did come in handy. One thing I have always been sour about. After I learned about God and how to pray and the words to say to worship Him, I prayed like crazy that he'd save me from Nick and my mother, that he'd somehow change her heart, make her not be the kind of woman who would make a deal with the devil for her own son's soul. You know what he did for me? Jack shit. The summer between graduation and law school, I brokered a deal of my own. I knelt at a crossroad near a boneyard and I said some words, and it was like seeing an old friend. Terms were discussed, payments arranged, time durations were set. We shook hands. He kissed my lips. I signed in blood. When my time was up, I ran like hell again. Bought a new identity, had plastic surgery, moved to fucking New Zealand, and Nick let me be. He always did have a soft spot for me. But I think my time is getting short. Lately, every time I go into a bar or a restaurant, that old blues song, Hellhound on My Trail, starts playing. I smell rotten eggs and sulfur everywhere. And every time I look in a mirror, I see very clearly a handsome man in the distance behind me, with a huge black snarling dog on a leash walking in front of him. I've made the best deal I could, and I don't see a lot of point in delaying things. There is a crossroad near a boneyard just outside the town where I bought a little house for cash under a fake name and passport. Tonight I think I will walk there and kneel and wait. I hope it hurts God to lose a soul like mine, and I hope Nick and I still have such lovely long talks. As the night deepened, so did the horrors lurking in the shadows, and in the next tale, the shadows weren't the only thing hiding secrets. The world is about to end again. Y'all are gonna think I'm crazy, but what makes this time any different from every other time? I've been poor, and I've been rich. I've assassinated officials, and I've worked in shelters and hospitals. I've been famous and infamous. I've been married to the same woman 763 times over now, and every time I've tried to change things. But now I'm just gonna write this. This is how I'll live out the last few weeks this time. I'm finally tired of trying to change things. I've just tried to live my own life this one time. I don't have a Groundhog Day. I've got a Groundhog life. Every time I'm born on September 1st, 1980 in Sand Gap, Kentucky. I always die the same day. We all do. I was lucky the first time out of the gate. Jess found me in Louisville. She's the angel that God sent to keep my sanity while I try over and over again to work out a problem that seemingly has no solution. She's the reason I keep going. Maybe someday I'll get to grow old with her. Hopefully someday I'll get it right. I decided this time, towards the end of this life, to just spend it with her at the lake. We've never been able to have kids. She's never wanted to adopt, so it's always just us. I'd never told her how many different times and lives we've had until this one. I told her in January. I told her what's about to happen. I could tell that she was afraid that I was losing my mind. Who isn't nowadays? It took 2 weeks of me predicting things that came true around the world until she started to believe me. All things considered, she took the news of the end of time pretty well. She's sitting outside on the deck right now, enjoying the evening, while I'm writing this and listening to my Oliver Anthony mix. I think I might just tell her every time from here on out. It felt good to get it off my chest. I had wanted to tell her so many times. Hundreds of lifetimes spent keeping what I know from my lobster. How many times am I going to have to watch that damn show? I told her that I'm not giving up. I'm going to keep trying to prevent it. But this one time, I just want to be with her. Maybe clear my mind. Figured I'd just put this out there, and maybe somebody else might have an idea. Maybe enough people might read this and wake up. I don't know. Division and hate is always more important than helping each other. Cries for war from the rich are always louder than the weak utterances of suffering from the poor. It's like this sickness was coded into the world's DNA from the beginning, and it always manifests itself right about now, and the only thing that destroys that fever is a hot war that kills the host, along with everything on it. Soon, my body will be born again, but the mind will stay. Back to square one. The problem will remain. How do I stop it? I'm the lone voice in the wilderness. Right before Christmas, the skies will fall in nuclear fire again, and those last few moments are always spent asking why, when the answer was always obvious. I'm not quitting. Eventually, I'll find the solution in another lifetime, but this one just belongs to me and her. Jess is calling me now, so I'm going to sign off and enjoy some whiskey and fireflies with my girl. I'm going to be selfish this time. Catch y'all on the next go-round. If you thought that was terrifying, hold on tight. The next story might just haunt you long after it's over. Where the Bad Cops Go, Part 1. I write this as a reminder to put all that I've seen and heard into words. For far too long, I've looked back on these past few years as something impossible, something that happened to someone else. But that's far from the truth. Even if the truth and I have always had a tentative relationship at the best of times, consider this a confession, a peek behind the curtain of something I never would have believed. Let's start from the top. My mother was a police officer in a busy metropolitan area. I never wanted to be a police officer like her, but it seemed inevitable. No matter what I tried to study, I would always fall back on that familiar role, the lawkeeper, arbiter and diplomat, the one who settles disputes and held people to their word. For a while I thought I might get into politics, but I get too flustered in debates. I can't stand a dishonest argument, so politician or lawyer were not an option. So when I say that I never wanted to be a police officer, that's God's honest truth. But I had to be. It was the only thing that made sense. My mother died of cervical cancer my last year at the academy, so when I finally got to walk my own beat, I couldn't help but to feel that I'd replaced her. My handler was very understanding of what I was going through, so when it was time to hit the streets, she cut me a lot of slack. A little too much, it turns out. See, there was this one part of the city that my handler told me to actively avoid. Whenever we got a call originating from this one area, my handler actively ignored it, unless it was something akin to an ongoing shootout. It got to the point where we would respond to calls, only to never show up. It was shady as hell, but practice is often very different from theory. I thought it was some kind of unwritten rule. Turns out, it was a lot worse than I'd imagined. My handler and a couple of other officers were economically involved with what can best be described as a smorgasbord of illicit dealings. Ignoring calls allowed both traffickers and dealers to run rampant, and we got a cut of the deal. Well, they did. The union swept a lot of it under the rug. 3 officers quit their jobs and went into private security, but I didn't want that. I still felt like I had my mom's boots on. I was in her place. So when it was my time to plead my case, I did what I could to make a fair and reasonable argument. But as I've said, I'm not good in debates. I remember the chief looking up from his papers as an advisor whispered in his ear. He gave me a concerned look. Obviously, we can't keep you here, he explained. But if you're really up for it, we got something in mind. But you gotta be really up for it. I agreed. Hell or high water, I'd do my job. This is how I ended up as a rookie in the Tomskog Police Department. Tomskog is a shitty little rural Minnesota town in the middle of nowhere. If you don't know where to take an uncomfortable left off the highway, you'll miss it. There are no signs, and most people who move there never leave. It's like a social black hole, the equivalent of unsubscribing from all internet platforms and walking into the woods. According to the chief, a lot of officers with questionable backgrounds were given a chance to work at Tomskog PD. Not because they desperately needed people, but because it was a good way to gain some brownie points with the local government and keeping the union happy. In fact, people with questionable ethics were encouraged at the Tomskog PD. I thought it might have to do with a lack of action. I mean, a bad cop can't really do any harm if there's nothing to do. I got to the station on a foggy November morning after a hasty over-the-weekend move. There was space for 2 squad cars on the lot out front, but both were out on patrol. A shoddy white plastic sign with Tomskog PD hung outside, along with the town seal, a blue sunflower on a golden shield. I'd never seen those things before I got to Tomskog, but all of a sudden, they were everywhere. 6 people looked up from their desks as I entered. Most of them paid me no mind, but the sheriff painstakingly got up from his chair to greet me. A man in his early 50s with the build of a human meatball and the handlebar mustache of an ex-wrestler. He reminded me of a cartoon character, only with less of a smile. "Mason Brooks," he said, offering a meaty hand. "My condolences." "Excuse me?" "My condolences," he repeated. "I imagine you ain't too excited to be here." Yeah, no, it's fine," I said. "Happy to be of service." "You shitting me?" He laughed. "Well, ain't you the belle of the ball?" He gave me the tour of the place, the armory, the evidence lockup, the holding cells, and of course my desk. If he hadn't pointed it out, I would have thought it was taken already. There was an unwashed coffee cup and a candy wrapper on it. "Don't mind that," Mason said. "People kinda come and go. Didn't figure this place would have that kind of turnover." You'd be surprised. He picked up a name sign from the edge of the desk. It was blank. I met my partner as he abused a vending machine. He was a balding man in his late 30s wearing a kind of pinkish round sunglasses that made me think of John Lennon. I offered him a bill to try the machine again, but he waved me off. "If you hit it just right, you don't have to pay," he said, giving the machine another bashing. Mason just grinned. Business as usual, it seemed. "This is Nick Aitken, your partner, and for the time being, handler," Mason explained. "Again, my condolences." "Shit, didn't I just have a partner?" Nick asked. "Either I haven't had my morning Irish or someone's beaten my head straight, because I can't see two of you," Mason frowned. "Desk is empty, name's gone, time for a newbie." "Right." Nick shook my hand as a Coke rolled out. He seemed more eager about a free Coke than to have someone watching his back. Mason gave me an apologetic smile. "He'll show you the ropes," he said. "Man's an idiot, but you'd do well to listen. Idiots live long round here." "He ain't joking about that," Nick added, not looking up from his Coke. And with that, we were on our way. Nick fired up a cigarette long before we left the station, then took me round the back to a civilian vehicle. An egg-white Volvo with rust stains that reminded me of bird shit. "All squad cars taken, huh?" I asked. "Yeah, folks are cleaning up after Patrick." "Sorry, what?" "You'll see. Maybe." Tomskog has a single main road stretching through the entire town. There was a gas station, a high school, a couple of shops, a peculiar flower shop at the corner that seemed to only sell those trademark blue sunflowers. There was a sort of upward tilt on the west side of town that made the houses look stacked on top of one another. On the other side of town was a vast lake, eloquently named Frog Lake, where houses stretched out along the western ridge. It was a peaceful enough place, and in the right light, you could tell it was someone's home. But like with most little towns, you can't imagine what kind of people live there. It's like when you see a house in the middle of nowhere. Who chooses to live there? What happened? I guess I hadn't yet come to the realization that I was about to become one of those people. Nick pulled up next to a corner pub, a place that looked old enough to have grandchildren. Before getting out of the car, Nick gave me a tired look. "We're just going to talk to a guy," he said. "He never comes into town unless there's something shitty going on. We're going to have a chat." "Got it. Don't ask him any questions. Leave that to me. And don't touch him. He's a bit contagious." "In what way?" "Every way that matters," he sighed. "And what did I say about questions? You said not to ask him any. You never said anything about asking you any." He tilted down his pink sunglasses, giving me a tired look. Shaking his head, he got out of the car. "I give you a week, rookie." Stepping into the pub, there was only two other people present. The owner, a sturdy man in his 70s who seemed transfixed on a thick-screen TV that played mostly static. The other was a man in his 40s with long dark hair. He had a couple of silver streaks running along his ears, a clean-shaven look, and a trucker cap. Much like Nick, the guy seemed comfortable wearing sunglasses indoors. "Digman," said Nick. "You dragged your sorry ass back to town, huh?" "Meeting family," the man smiled. "It's a special day." "You gonna cause any trouble?" "Of course not." "Let me rephrase that," said Nick, throwing me a tired look. "What kind of trouble you causing?" "Nothing," the man replied. "Just meeting family, maybe going for a walk." Nick wasn't very happy with that answer, but there was little he could do. They said their goodbyes, and we stepped outside. The moment we got out, Nick fired up another cigarette and called it in. "Digman's up to some shit," he spoke into the radio. "Keep a tail on him." Mason's voice came through. They didn't seem to bother with codes or formalities. "Nick, you're a snake. You're all tail. You stick to him." "Come on," Nick groaned. "The newbie can do it." "Do we need to have a discussion about the division of labor, Nick?" Nick took his hands off the radio and looked up at the sky with a sigh. "No, sir. That was our first assignment, spying on a civilian for no obvious reason. We saw how he met a shady-looking young man in his 20s, and the two of them spent a lot of time talking, eating nachos, and catching up. Meanwhile, I was trying to pass the time by getting to know Nick and the town a little better. "Tell me something," I said. "What makes being a cop here different from everywhere else?" Nick adjusted his sunglasses. "We don't sign reports," he said matter-of-factly. "What do you mean?" "I mean what I said, rookie. We don't sign reports." "Of course you do. Everyone does." "Well, we don't." He looked back at Digman through the window, deeming him not to be an active threat. "I mean, yeah, we got paperwork, but we don't really do it," he clarified. "Say you find a dead guy in an alley with his throat slit. What'd you do?" That's a crime scene. You gotta..." Nick worked up an error sound, like the wrong answer at a game show. "You say it's an accident, you file it, and that's that. That's what you do." "Hell no. Hell yes you do. And you know why?" He turned to me, looking over his sunglasses. Something stern came over him. "Because if you don't, people die." He explained it as best as he could. The Tomskog PD never truly investigated anything on paper, because if they did, there'd be people coming by to ask questions. Questions like why people kept getting murdered, or why there were so many accidents out by Lake Attabat. And with questions, there'd be investigators, reporters, and government agents. "We can't have that," Nick continued. "They don't understand this town, and they'll get themselves killed. We're doing a necessary evil to keep the lid on." "That doesn't make any sense." 35 people died here last year," Nick continued. "In a town of 7,500-something people, you know where that puts us? That's the highest murder rate in the country, by a mile. Hell, we make St. Louis look like a cotton candy petting zoo. Doesn't make sweeping it under the rug any less shitty. More than half of those who died were outsiders. Relatives, good Samaritans, passers-by. If we can stop them from coming here, that means less dead folks stuffed in containers around the high school." He turned his attention back to the pub, leaning back in his seat. Without looking at me, he asked, "So if we find a guy with a sliced throat in an alley, what do you say?" "I ain't saying it. Play ball here, newbie. I ain't asking, I'm telling." I swallowed my pride. The sheriff had asked me to listen to this man, and I wasn't about to mess up on my first day. I didn't like where this was going, and I wasn't buying that whole shtick, but I wasn't going to make any enemies. Not today. "Sounds like an accident," I said, rolling my eyes. "Awful stuff. A goddamn tragedy." Over the next few days, Nick and I tailed this Digman fellow, but there wasn't much to see. He kept to himself most of the time. Instead, we ended up going around town, responding to various requests and reports. Mostly domestic stuff, but a few odd cases popped up here and there. For example, every squad car had a BB gun for shooting frogs. We spent a good couple of hours on that. When asking about it, Nick just told me we did it to keep folks from catching the nastiest headache of their lives. He did not elaborate. There were other cases as well. We had to get a woman who'd eaten a bucket of dirt to a hospital. We had to take down fake stop signs that someone had put up by the road leading out of town. Once a week, we had to go to the closed-down Tomskog Public Library and burn a copy of the Diary of Emmett Rask, who seemed to come back on its own. It was clear that this town was nothing like I'd imagined. This wasn't your average small-town kind of living. This was survival in a place where basic rules of life seemingly came and went. Much like the many rookies of Tomskog PD. Over the weeks to come, I was having trouble adapting to life in Tomskog. We were filling out half-assed reports that sometimes outright lied, and no one seemed bothered by it. I started to feel a sort of resignation. My colleagues took notice, but there wasn't much they could do. Nick was actually pretty sweet about it. He tried to show me around town and introduce me to the various folks who lived there. It was clear that he was making an effort in his own casual way. I got myself a small house at the far end of town, just off the main road. The prices were ridiculous. I could afford a 2-story, 5-room house as a single woman with a police officer's salary. Despite that, I settled for something a bit smaller. I figured the prices were just going to drop further, so any buy was a loss, but with the numbers we were talking about, it didn't really matter. Still, getting settled in Tomskog was just odd. That's the best word for it. I barely considered myself a police officer anymore. I felt like a street sweeper. I wasn't serving or protecting. I was systematically ignoring problems for money. And not only that, but I was expected to do so. The turning point came on New Year's Eve. There were 4 of us staffing the phones, but most of us had mentally checked out hours ago. I was playing games on my work computer, and the other 3 were having a dart contest in the break room. Nick was about 4 beers in. I almost missed the phone ringing. We had one line for rerouted calls from emergency services and a direct line. I'd never seen the direct line ring before. I answered it. "Hi there," a woman on the other end said. "This is Miss Babin. I'm going to have to ask you to send a few officers." "What is this concerning, ma'am?" "I'm not entirely sure," she continued, "but I think something is affecting the residents." "Something?" I asked. "Like an animal?" "You better put Nick on the line, dear." I called Nick over. He had a short conversation with the person on the other end, then slapped his own face with an open hand. "Shit," he whistled, and the others perked up. He cleared his throat and put his hands on his hips. "We got a situation at the Babin building. We're heading out." There was no discussion. Whatever it was big enough to make Nick put on a serious face. I don't think I'd seen him really do that until that point. I drove. It was the first time we turned the sirens on. Nick was checking his handgun over and over. "This is Digman," he groaned. "I don't know how or why, but it's gotta be. Man's a menace." "You two got history?" "Everyone's got history with Digman. Bad history." I took a right, following the northernmost road to the outskirts of town, past the gas station. There was an apartment building with several cars parked outside. The moment I stopped the car, Nick was out the door. The others weren't far behind. I ran to catch up with him, and as he opened the front door, he called back to me. "Oh, and don't talk to Roy. He's a freak." The moment I stepped inside, I could taste some kind of chemical in the air. Ammonia, maybe a bit of chlorine. Nick didn't seem too bothered by the smell, but I could tell he was worried. He turned to me as we got to the stairs. "You want to protect and serve, right?" "Yeah," I said, blinking at the question. "Of course. Then get to the top floor and start moving people. This place is contaminated." "With what?" "No idea. I'm going to check it out." While Nick went to speak with the landlord, me and the other 2 officers went up the stairs. The others stopped short of my floor, but I kept going. The smell was getting stronger, and I could feel it settling in the back of my throat. Some sort of chemical spill. This thing was going to stick to their furniture, no doubt about it. I knocked on the door of the top floor. Someone rushed to open it. I figured they'd been waiting to get the all clear to leave, so I relaxed a little. But as the door flung open, I didn't face a thankful citizen. It was a woman in her early 60s, her pupils so widened that they looked black. I'd seen plenty of people on drugs before, but this was a whole other level. She stared at me with this huge grin, and as she did, I saw one of her teeth fall out of her open mouth. It clattered against her homemade welcome mat. Before I could introduce myself, she attacked me. She had this blue tint on her hands, like she'd accidentally washed them in some kind of ink. That's where the smell was coming from. It had the same powerful chemical stench to it that the rest of the building was bathing in. Those hands dove for my face as if she wanted to pinch my cheeks. "Little wheat," she laughed. "You came to the harvest." She was surprisingly strong, but she had no technique. My heart skipped a beat as I got a meaty slap across the chest, and she tugged at my radio, but I managed to wrestle her to the ground. I put her in a hold that would make a grown man cry, but she laughed like a shrieking maniac. As I handcuffed her, I could see other doors around the floor open. There were 3 men in their 20s, still wearing party hats from their New Year's celebration. One with the blue stuff coming out of his ears, another from his mouth. The third looked like he was crying it. Another door with what looked like a married couple and a young girl. Yet another door with an older man, wandering out in nothing but his stained underwear. All of them with those blackened pupils and unearthly smiles. Some of them getting an occasional twitch, like their nerves were settling in cold water. "Little wheat," one chuckled. "She comes willingly. We are blessed, we are so blessed." And still the old woman under my knee laughed herself hoarse. I was outnumbered. They sprang to action, rushing me, almost tripping over one another. I dove into the old woman's apartment, kicking the door closed with the heel of my boot. I hurried up to lock it, and as they piled up against the door, I tripped backwards, knocking over a vase. The attackers were throwing themselves at the door with wild abandon. Yes, yes, she plays, someone laughed. Come see the harvest. Little wheat. I was cornered on the top floor. I touched my radio, but I couldn't get a message through. Everyone was talking all at once. I wasn't the only one panicking. This wasn't just happening on my floor. I had my taser and my firearm. I was trying to make sense of it in my head. Sure, it'd probably get swept under the carpet one way or another, but I'd never fired my gun at a living person before. It was my first time going to be firing openly at 7 civilians, one of which was a child. Was I even capable of that? But as the door buckled and the door frame creaked, I was going to have to make a tough decision. Would I fight to live another day or accept whatever may come? What kind of protect and serve would I represent? Another slam at the door. I needed time. I needed something. Anything. So I ran into the bathroom. I backed into it, locking it the moment the front door came down. The lights were off, and all I heard was this light drizzle, like someone had left the shower on. I turned the lights back on. My eyes stung. The smell was so pungent that it burned my nose, forcing me to sneeze. As my eyes adjusted, I realized I wasn't alone. There was an old man on the floor. It looked like he'd slipped and slammed his shoulder against the side of the toilet. He couldn't get up. He was almost entirely covered in that blue sludge, and I realized it was still running from the shower and the tap. He was looking at me, his eyes wide and black, his face half smiling at me, partially paralyzed. It'll eat. It'll eat. Banging on the bathroom door. Laughter. Anywhere else, that'd just be what New Year's Eve was supposed to sound like. But to me, it was a promise. There was no doubt in my mind that these people would do something horrible to me if they got the chance. I had my hand on my service weapon, trying to figure out what to do. I've never been great with debates, not even in my own head. I kept going back and forth. I could do a warning shot first, then I'd go for kill shots as soon as that door budged. Or should I go for the leg? Should I do something about the old man? Was he a threat? Did I have enough bullets? I am armed and ready to defend myself, I called out. No response. Just more laughter and nonsensical gibberish. My hand was shaking. I was more scared than I'd realized. I will fire, I yelled. I am warning you, I will shoot to kill. Nothing. If anything, it just made them cheer even more. Louder. Eager. Little wheat. Little wheat. Little wheat. Come to the harvest. The radio came through. Nick, what's happening up there? They're breaking in the door. I yelled back. I need backup. Hide, he screamed back. Can you get to the bathroom? I'm locked in. It's that chemical thing. It makes him crazy. I looked at the shower. It was still running, making a viscous goo that dripped at a steady pace. The door buckled. I saw the flash of a black-eyed grinning face as the hinges struggled. Another voice came through, the woman from the phone. She was using Nick's radio. They use the smell, she said. If you can smell like them, they won't attack. Looking at the running shower, I had an idea. It sounded insane, but this town didn't play by the rules. I was going to have to adapt. I put my service weapon away and pulled down the shower curtain, wrapping it around and over me like a cocoon. Then I stepped into the shower. I watched the blue goo run off of me. Even through the plastic, it felt warm to the touch. Whatever this was, it was downright toxic, no doubt about it. As the door gave way with a crackling wooden bang, I pushed myself into a corner, hoping for the best as the shower kept running. They all slowed down to look at me. All those eyes turning my way. Even through the blue-tinted haze of the shower curtain, I could see their exaggerated grins, their nonsensical words rotating into something new, something calmer. Joined the harvest, yes. Yes, joined. The Reaper came. Thank you, little wheat. I clutched the shower curtain close to me, begging that I wouldn't get any blue stuff on me. It ran right off, but soaked into the soles of my shoes. I can't overstate how awful the smell was, and as we all stood there looking at one another, I was coming to terms with just how screwed I might be. They could reach me in less than a second if they wanted to. And even if they didn't, the fumes of this thing would be enough to send me sprawling to the floor in a matter of minutes. I wasn't getting any air, no matter how hard I breathed. It was like my lungs were coated with something sick. I was blinking to stay conscious. What the hell had I been thinking? This was like trying to save yourself from drowning by wrapping your head in a plastic bag. It was just another way to suffocate. I couldn't feel my knees, but they were locked upright. But even with the tiniest sway, I'd fall like a Jenga tower. And that'd be it. I felt my fingers touch the tip of my service weapon. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe I could just kill them all and be done with it. But no, I couldn't. I was losing control. I couldn't move my thumb. I'll fire, I wheezed. I have a right to defend myself. I dipped in and out of consciousness, leaning against the wall. There was commotion in the other room. A couple of people left, a few stayed to look at me. I could hear the crackling of a taser, breaking furniture. I didn't recognize the voices, but I could hear the trained cadence of other officers. I must have blacked out at some point. I tried taking a step forward and ended up collapsing on the floor. The shower curtain unfurled, all covered in blue, staining the floor like one of the town's trademark blue sunflowers. I ended up face to face with the old man. We shared a moment just looking at one another across the bathroom floor. Him grinning like a maniac, me just trying to stay conscious. "Why are you smiling?" I whispered. "Because it's all a joke, little wheat. And it's so funny." Seconds later, someone grabbed me by the shoulders. I was dragged out of the apartment, getting a quick look at what happened. We'd gotten back up, 4 other officers, including Sheriff Mason himself. The attackers had been tased, zip-tied, and handcuffed. They'd just pushed the kid into a wardrobe and barred the door. As my vision cleared, I watched Nick taking off my boots. "It hasn't soaked through," he sighed. "You'll be okay. Sorry I didn't help." "You kiddin'?" he scoffed. "No casualties. A couple broken bones and a few bruises. Yeah, but these people are gonna be fine." He looked back into the apartment. They were still writhing around, moaning about harvests and wheat. Nick shrugged, looking back at me. "I mean, kind of fine." In the hours to come, the remaining people were evacuated. Most folks would recover after a couple of thorough scrubbings. Others had to be hospitalized. I spent the next few hours sitting in our bird-shit civvy Volvo, trying to figure out if my legs were to be trusted yet. I could still taste the ammonia. I was going to need 100 showers. I caught a conversation between Nick and Mason. The sheriff was furious as to how they hadn't prepared for this. Nick recounted every call we'd checked out over the past few weeks, and nothing stood out. That is, until he got to John Digman. He said he had family in town. Nick explained. They were going to catch up. "Going for a walk," I smiled. "Doesn't sound too bad." Mason turned to me slowly, then back to Nick. "Go for a walk?" Mason frowned. "He said that?" "John Digman said he was going for a walk?" "Not specifically that he was, but yeah," said Nick. "So what? And you're telling me this now?" Mason looked like he was about to beat Nick with his own shoe. Instead, he bit down on his handlebar mustache like an improvised binky. "He's doing it," Mason sighed. "That rust-brained possum fuck is going to do a goddamn year walk." "A what?" Mason pushed Nick up against the hood of the car, pointing at him with his entire hand. Mason was pissed. More pissed than I'd ever seen him. "A year walk. Get your mom's tits out of your ears and perk up, you scab-faced shitlicker. A year walk." Mason walked away, putting his phone to his ear. He looked back at Nick from the other side of the parking lot, still screaming at the top of his lungs. "Call the duck. Tell him we need 2 of everything. 1:15 yesterday." Nick calmly walked to the driver's side of the car, opened the door, and sat down. He took off his pink-shaded sunglasses and buried his face in his arms, leaning against the steering wheel. For a moment, we just sat there, breathing together. As if there was a chance this would all blow over any second, if we could just hold on a little longer. Nick leaned back, keeping his eyes closed. I felt like I had to say something. "I take it that calling the duck is bad." "Yeah," he nodded. "It's bad." "How bad are we talking?" He looked at me with a kind of earnest sympathy that I'd never seen in him before. This was taking a toll. A real toll. This wasn't silly glasses Nick. This was I got bad news Nick. He opened his mouth, but all that came out was a stutter. Finally, he just threw up his arms in surrender. "No idea, but it's as bad gets. This is the emergency glass you break after all other glass has already broke. The alarms that other alarms pull to get out of trouble. It's the worst." "I'm counting on overtime then." It was a comment to lighten the mood, but Nick just shook his head. Without a word, he got out, leaving his pink sunglasses behind. He walked off, screaming expletives as he dialed the longest number I'd ever seen. All the while, the New Year's Eve celebrations were going strong. Rockets and lantern lighting up the sky to distant cheers. Warmth was returning to my hands and feet. I was starting to understand. When they said the town of Tomskog was unlike anything else, this was what they were talking about. It wasn't just some hick town in the middle of nowhere. It was a place where the rules are different. And where rules are different, laws had to be different. This wasn't just the place where the bad cops go. We were a necessary evil. And in the months to come, that was going to be a hard lesson to learn. Where the bad cops go, Part 2. For a couple of weeks after our run-in with the contaminated apartment building, there were a lot of people coming and going. Sheriff Mason had called in the cavalry. I saw a couple of unmarked vans, and at one point, a bus, a sort of mobile base. I saw people associated with the Duck once. They were wearing a sort of battery-powered full-cover helmet that looked straight out of a cheap sci-fi flick. Mason was too busy to be bothered, but I talked a lot with Nick. Apparently, these were the people you called in when there was something you couldn't normally handle. Things like lactose parasites, a virus that reacted to delta waves, or a being that could camouflage itself so well that you needed a type of paranoid schizophrenia to see them. The stories he told were outright mad, but they were all second or third-hand accounts, and slightly embellished. I only met him once back in 13, Nick explained. We got containment duty. Nasty business. An eruption or localized geological event spewed a bunch of cave gunk into the air, made some kind of thing go wonky. It all sort of smelled like dinner to him. What do you mean, thing? I didn't see him. I just sprayed down the cars and hoped they'd go another way. But we didn't have enough drainage, so it was a mess. Nick shook his head with a sigh. If we got these people around, there's going to be problems. But we got bigger problems if they ain't here. Mason didn't keep us in the loop. Most of the time, he sent us out on seemingly random errands. One time, we were to sit by a field of blue sunflowers, armed with shotguns, tasked to shoot anything that moved. Anything. Luckily, we didn't see anything, but still. Another time, he asked us to go to supermarkets in the area and buy a number of items. We were then to meet up with an associate that would handle the items and double-check for statistical issues. Didn't sound all too bad, but I got a bit nervous when the lady we handed it to came fully geared in one of those CDC hazmat suits. There was no patch or mark. She was unaffiliated. We also had to do bi-daily check-ins on Frog Lake, both to make sure the frog population was in check, but also to see if someone was swimming around. It was early January, but apparently it was known to happen. The lake had historical significance to the area, and people sometimes did strange things in it. I remember stopping at the local gas station for a hot dog with Nick once. We'd been out to check the trees for red birds all day, and I was getting sick and tired of being thrown around town like a wet napkin. This wasn't police work, and I made my dissatisfaction known, at least to Nick. I hear ya, he said, but we don't have anyone else. The closest fire department is up in St. Cloud, and the less we talk about animal control, the better. I don't get it, I sighed. Sheriff just drops a weird word and all of a sudden it's high alert for weeks on end? The year walk thing, Nick corrected. Yeah, it's gonna be months. So you know what this is? A year walk? Right, he continued, finishing his hot dog. It's like an idiot holding up an eat me sign and all kinds of weird shit shakes loose to have a bite. And anyone can do this at any time? Nah, you gotta be in the right place at the right time. There's gotta be like an intent. He tapped the side of his head. And you gotta be an idiot. While the sheriff and the higher-ups kept chasing their tails with big-picture stuff, we were the boots on the ground. Nick and I were kept in the dark about a lot of details, but we were still expected to drop everything at the drop of a hat. I mean, that's the job, but it's not what I signed up for. I contemplated quitting outright. There were other jobs around Tomskog to apply for, and this just didn't seem worth it. We were always on call, and sometimes we'd get rung up for the most ridiculous things. Like this one time when I got a call to check on an elderly woman. I was to see if she had something in her ear. If she didn't, I was to give her migraine medication. How is that urgent enough to wake me at 2:30 a.m.? But that's the thing with Tomskog. No matter the call, it's a coin flip between nothing and a nightmare. And we were due for a nightmare. One day we got a call about someone dumping trash by the side of the road. It wasn't a priority call, but the sheriff was too busy to hand out any other orders. So yeah, Nick and I checked it out. It was an early January morning. Sun was still rising and the snow from the previous night was still settling. Not a cloud in sight, just a light mist rising from the warming frost. The kind of weather where it feels like summer but looks like winter. Nick pulled over and smacked the dashboard. His sunglasses looked more pink than usual. Up and at 'em, we're here. I stepped out to see a washing machine by the side of the road. Cables and pipes and all. It looked to be a couple generations behind, but still pretty modern. The only weird thing about it was the color. It was solid black. I guess we just haul it off, I said. You got a junkyard? Nick wasn't convinced. He walked up to it and opened the hatch. Something black inside. Looks like oil. So it's broken. Then why didn't they throw it away? How is leaving it by the side of the road not throwing it away? Nick nodded, adjusting his pink sunglasses and scratching his head. I dunno about this one, he admitted. This has weird shit written all over it. We called Sheriff Mason and got a clear order to drive the thing out of town and drop it off a cliff. I thought it was an exaggeration, but he made it abundantly clear. Not burn it, not crush it, not dump it at a yard, drive it far out of town and drop it off a steep cliff. It was odd, to say the least, but we were used to it by then. We tipped the thing over, draining the liquid, and threw it in the back of the car. It was a strange substance, like a watery black pudding. It kept bubbling, despite not being warm. Nick kicked it off the road, threw a rock at it, and we were on our way. We took a long ride out of town, following a dirt road that barely been touched. We drove past Lake Attabat and took a turn at what looked like an old quarry. I gave Nick a curious look. Boss said drop it off a cliff. So we're dropping it off a cliff. And up we went. We took the thing out all the way up. I could tell this was a sort of gathering for high school kids. The only thing left behind were empty beer cans and half-smoked, poorly rolled joints. Nick didn't seem to notice or care. We pushed the washing machine all the way to the edge at the top of the quarry. It's strange. You don't know how high up you really are until you look down. Every whiff of wind that passed by made the cliff whistle, and every uneasy step had this long echo to it. Nick didn't seem all too bothered by it. I started to suspect that maybe he'd been one of the kids who hung out here once upon a time. We braced ourselves and gave the washing machine a final push off a cliff. It wasn't a straight drop. The thing bounced against the side 2 to 3 times, gaining in speed, before it splashed into the water far below. It took about a minute before it sunk, and when it did, I could see something black pouring out, puddling on the surface of the water. I'm sure it's fine, Nick smiled. Let's get lunch. There wasn't that much going on for the rest of the day. The sheriff was pleased to hear that we'd followed his orders to the letter. Apparently, we'd solved the Hank Byrne issue before it even started. He did not elaborate. As that day came to an end and I changed into my civilian clothes, I found a black spot on my socks. Turns out a splotch from the washing machine had stuck to them. I didn't think much about it. I just threw it all into my laundry basket. I figured I'd deal with it soon enough, but as these things often go, I kind of forgot about it. We got really busy the next few days. Some of the folks we ran into at the Babin apartment complex were facing complications and had to be hospitalized. We were called in to provide assistance, literally holding some of them down as they were given medication. Even after all this time, some of them still had blue discoloration on their skin. Nick also made an effort to check in on John Digman and his family, just dropping by occasionally to check on him from afar, making sure there was nothing strange going on. I couldn't help but to get the feeling that Nick resented these people. I didn't quite understand why. Yes, the Digman fellow had started something, but I couldn't grasp what it was. But the younger guy, he just seemed like a scared kid. Hell, he barely ever left his apartment. It took me weeks to even get his name. Peter, or using his nickname, Perry. It was after a particularly long day that I came home to a strange sensation. I was kicking off my shoes when I felt a salty smell. It took me a while to realize it was coming from the laundry basket. I hadn't thought about it for some time, but opening it made a wall of stench wash over me. Pushing some underwear and shirts aside, I found my stained socks. Except it wasn't just a little black stain stuck to the side anymore. It had grown to the size of a tennis ball, and it was pulsating. Yeah, I wasn't having it. I'd seen enough of Tomskog to know it was not the kind of thing I wanted to get involved in. Instead, I tossed all of my used clothes in, closed the basket, and took it out back. I grabbed some lighter fluid from the kitchen and set the whole thing on fire. I thought I heard a scream from it, but I convinced myself it was just air pressure. Perhaps it was. Once there was nothing but ashes left, I took a shovel and buried it in a hole at the edge of my property. Just in case. Then it was business as usual. We spent an entire day throwing garbage bags into an incinerator. Another day we checked horses for fleas. Not the kind of police work I'd imagined, but whatever. At least I wasn't alone in my misery. Nick was right there, sharing the suffering. But late at night, I couldn't help but to worry. I'd find myself glancing out the window to where I'd buried that thing, imagining it swelling like pus in the dirt. At times I'd convince myself that I could taste that salty smell in the air. The stress of moving to Tomskog had reignited an old habit of mine, smoking. I'm not proud of it, but it was a way to deal with things, like holding hands with an old and terrible friend. At times I'd wake up in the middle of the night and sit by the window, having a cigarette as I imagined something erupting from the ground, just out of sight. One of those nights were worse than the others. We had an awful snow-mixed rainfall. It was practically snowing sideways, the kind of weather where you could put a hand out the window and make a snowball. It was eerie, sounding like little taps against the windows. Someone could have knocked on my door, and I wouldn't even notice. It snowed all day. Nick and I had mostly stayed at the station, answering calls and writing up reports. There'd been some lights flickering earlier, making me unsure about firing up my computer. Power wasn't always a certain thing in Tomskog, it seemed. I stuck to my phone instead, playing some music to drown out the howling wind. Every now and then, I'd peer out the window. I couldn't see anything on a good day, but during a stormy night, I could barely see my car. It was all dark. I'd put on a playlist and cracked a window to blow out some cigarette smoke. I watched the smoke swirl and twist until the wind caught it. It was almost poetic in a way, the natural state of things taking away all the bad, one cutting breeze at a time. Then, as I blew out the last of my cigarette, the smoke shifted. I was blowing straight into something solid, like a black wall. There was something pitch black right in front of me. My heart skipped a beat. Looking up, I saw the snow gather around the edges of something impossible, tall and dark as the night. I could guess the vague silhouette of a person, but it was so dark that it looked invisible. It was at least 9 feet tall and solid black, and still as a grave. I slowly stepped back, keeping my eyes on it. I reached for my phone, clicking off the music. The thing outside didn't make any noise. It just stood there. Now, I'd seen things since I got to Tomskog, but this was something completely different. It wasn't just weird or quirky. It was downright impossible. There was nothing like this in the history books. They don't teach you about this at the academy. This was the kind of thing only nightmares can teach you about. I looked down at my phone, placing my thumb on the number pad. I didn't dare to look away for too long, shifting my gaze up and down between the thing at the window and my phone. Sheriff Mason was higher up in my contact list than Nick, so I just made the first call I could. I had to reach someone, anyone. 2 signals passed. "What?" the sheriff answered. "There's something outside my window," I whispered. "It's tall, ink black, maybe 9 feet. It's just standing there." "What?" he repeated. "It's outside right now. I don't know what to do." "Didn't you throw the goddamn washing machine off a cliff?" I wait, yes? Then how are you? There was a crackling noise as something moved. I gasped, and the sheriff shut up. A 5-fingered black hand gently pressed against the window, causing something dark to drip down the side and pooling at the bottom of the window frame. The thing looked in with a blank, featureless face. No eyes or nose or mouth, just a head, like it only barely remembered what a person was supposed to look like. "I think it's trying to get in," I whispered. What do I do? Is it all black?" All the way through? Yeah, I think so. You see nothing white? Nothing at all? No, I said, looking a little closer. No, there's nothing. The hand pressed harder. The glass shook, and as cracks gathered, it was already too late. It only took a second. The window shattered and a long arm reached for me. The warmth of my home dissipated as a freezing wind forced its way in. Shards of glass littered my bedroom carpet. I was casually dressed in a pair of sweatpants and a simple white top. Up until now, that'd been enough. All of a sudden, it felt like nothing. I dropped to the floor, not even noticing my phone bouncing away. The long arm seemed to bend and twist at impossible angles, fumbling towards me. It knocked down a painting and my bedside table, along with a lamp that shattered on the floor, destroying the last of what little light I had. I crawled under my bed, searching desperately for my phone and cutting my hands on the broken glass. I looked back as I heard another creaking noise, watching a long leg gently step inside. I could hear a distorted voice coming through my phone, somewhere off to the other side of the bed. Reaching for it, something stirred in the back of my mind. I pulled my hand back. At the speed of a heartbeat, one of those long, ink-like arms reached all the way across my bed and slammed down a viscous fist on my phone, pulverizing it with a force that made the floor bend and crack. I stayed under my bed, instinctively covering my mouth with my bleeding hands. I tried to control my breathing as to not snort my own blood. The thing was inside my home. The window was broken. I heard an uneven stomping as the thing stumbled back and forth. It had the dexterity of a newborn deer on ice, slipping on carpets and cables, thrashing against every corner of furniture and every door left askew. It's as if it didn't understand what a home was and recognized everything only as frustrating obstacles. As soon as something moved, it would launch itself in that direction with complete abandon, crushing anything in its path. Because of its size, it would accidentally knock things off tables and walls, which in turn would cause it to turn and attack. And still, it didn't say a thing. No grunting, no huffing, nothing. Looking around, the only thing within my reach was my cigarettes and lighter. I had my car keys in my pocket, but I'd need those if I were to get out of there. As the thing thrashed around in my living room, I planned my next move. It was only a matter of time before it found me, and I had to be proactive. I was gonna trick it to give myself some time. As a dull moment lulled, I looked out from under my bed and angled my hand towards the broken window. With a flick of the wrist, I threw my cigarettes and lighter, hitting the corner of a dangling shard. There was a little tink sound, not enough for the thing to notice. But as the shard came loose in the wind, I held my breath. It fell. It shattered against the window frame, and a smattering of footsteps came thundering towards me from the living room. It took the bait. In little more than a second, a dark mass threw itself out the window, bringing along whatever shards had managed to hold on. That thing was so big that I could feel the rush of the wind follow it. It fumbled around in the snow, desperately smashing and stomping at everything and anything. I had to make a judgment call. Should I try to sneak by or make a run for it? I decided to play it safe. I took it slow. I crawled out, holding my breath. I chose my steps carefully, but it was dark. It was hard to tell what I was stepping on. I poked around with my big toe, making sure I didn't step on any big shards of glass. The thing was too busy messing around outside to notice. Taking my hands off my mouth, I slowly relaxed my lungs. I forced new air in, the cold mixing with my adrenaline to send shivers down my spine. Making my way into the living room, I could feel my weight pressing down on the wooden frame of a fallen photo. I think it was my graduation picture. The frame slipped, and I lost my footing. The world turned upside down as I landed face first on the floor, losing my breath with a violent thump. I could tell I'd bruised my shoulder. The noise outside stopped, and for a second or two, there was a perfect silence. Then it attacked. I looked back as it came crawling back inside like a squirming tadpole. I got up on my feet, rushing towards the front door. I had a head start, but it was gaining on me. I caught a break as it tripped over my couch, but even then a long arm managed to brush against the back of my head, fingertips sticking to my hair like freshly chewed gum. I ran outside, the snow soaking straight through my socks. Keeping my head low, I ran for my car. A click of a button, and I dove in on the passenger side. The moment I did, a wet hand slapped against the window, accidentally closing the door behind me. The hand was large enough to cover the window almost entirely. For a brief moment, I thought I'd made it. It couldn't get in. Then the glass started to crack. I remember crawling backwards over to the driver's side. I heard this murmur, a begging. I didn't even realize it was coming from me. As the window on the passenger side door shattered, I rolled out the driver's side door. It would have to crawl through the car to get to me, I thought. But no, it was too late. The arm was too long. It reached all the way through the car, grabbed my legs, and pulled. I was dragged through both windows, straight through the car, and thrown out on the other side. My whole body felt like a cold bruise. I couldn't get up. I tried to move, but I just managed to roll a couple inches, panting for dear life. That thing loomed over me, ready to strike, to crush me. It had no face, but it moved its head like it observed me, bobbing back and forth like a snake. And still, in that moment, I was trying to fight. It was all I could do. So when it raised its impossibly long arms, I expected all the lights in my mind to go out, that I'd done all I could, and that'd be that. And in that split second, a primal fear gripped me. I regretted everything, absolutely everything. But I heard a light tone. The world stood still for a moment. Another light tone, a distant car. It was honking. I tried my luck just a little and moved, but felt a massive hand press me down, albeit carefully. It was curious and didn't pay me no mind for now. But it wasn't letting me go anytime soon. A car rolled around the corner, and the driver got out as soon as we got caught in the headlights. It made me realize how dark this thing really was. It reflected nothing. It was like a black hole. Sheriff Mason stepped out, wearing nothing but a shirt, cotton slacks, and a pair of slippers. He waved at us, forcing a whistle from the lips hidden behind his walrus-like mustache. "Hey!" he called out. "Hank! Hank, burn!" The thing turned to him, letting me go as it did. Whatever this was, it found Mason far more interesting. Mason stepped forward, silently ushering me to get inside my house with his left hand, making a phone gesture. He wanted me to call someone. Nick, probably. I hurried inside. The last owner still had a landline, and I figured I might as well use it. As I did, I could still hear them speak outside. "Hank, I'm sorry," Mason said. "I thought you were safe and sound. I didn't think you'd get lost like this." There was no response, but Mason paused as if there was. "This must be scary, I know," he continued. "And painful. Terribly painful. I get it. You never asked for any of this." There was a thump. The creature moved. "Look, I got you something. I know it hurts, son. It hurts bad. This is what you're looking for, right?" A pop of a trunk, a shuffling noise. A couple more thumps. "There we go," Mason sighed. "It's okay. Take as many as you want." As the thumping grew distant, Mason came inside the house. I'd called Nick and screamed at him to hurry over, and for a short moment it was just me and the sheriff. He flipped over my couch and collapsed on it, taking a long, shivering breath. I couldn't tell if he was scared or freezing, or both. What did you do?" "I got him a bunch of bones." "Bones?" "Yes, ma'am," Mason nodded. "Bones. You gotta give me more than that." "Fair enough," he groaned. "You've earned it." Turns out, in a town like Tomskog, some things never really go away. And many years ago, when a sick high school kid got crushed by a washing machine, it seems that something got stuck. So Hank, he repeats what he remembers, Mason explained. And that kid, he remembers something awful. "And what is that?" Mason looked me in the eyes, and for a moment I wasn't paying attention to his stupid mustache or his bacon-fed cheeks. This was a man who'd seen things. He remembers all his bones breaking and wants to put himself back together. Nick showed up after a while. He'd let me with him for a couple of days as we replaced the windows. I was slowly coming to terms with the fact that if the sheriff hadn't shown up, that thing would have literally ripped the bones from my body. Now, it was free to roam however it wanted. Something that didn't seem all too alarming for Sheriff Mason. It was to be a later issue, it seemed. As Nick drove me back to his place, I clutched a plastic bag with toiletries and clothes and wondered, did I want to do this? Could I? Why? Nick patted me on the shoulder, snapping me back to reality. We watched the snow collapsing against the windshield. Wipers went back and forth, struggling against the glass. "It's okay," Nick smiled. "We got this." I looked ahead at the endless tunnel of dark. I took a deep breath. feeling the salty sting of sweat burn against my wounds. I watched Nick's pink sunglasses vibrate on the dashboard and felt the absence of my cigarettes. "Yeah," I nodded. "We got this." But the terror doesn't end there. Sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that hit closest to home. I live in a town that doesn't let anyone leave. Listen closely, because this isn't a story. It's a warning. There's a place, a town not on any map, tucked away in a corner of the world so secret it barely exists. No one talks about it. Maybe they've forgotten. Maybe they've learned to forget. But it's real, and if you find it, you'll never be able to leave. I escaped once, but it's only a matter of time before they find me again. I don't have long, so listen carefully. The town didn't look unusual at first. If anything, it was painfully ordinary. Rows of houses with neat lawns, crooked lampposts lining empty streets, a town square with a statue of a man no one could name. At a glance, it could have been anywhere, the kind of place you pass through without a second thought. But the moment I stepped into it, I felt something was wrong. Something thick in the air, like static before a storm. No one spoke about it, but we all felt it, the silent law. You could hear it in the footsteps that never strayed from the path, and see it in the faces that never turned toward the clock tower. The law was never written down, never spoken aloud, but everyone knew it. You didn't question the town, you didn't step out of line, and you never tried to leave. At first, I did what everyone else did. I followed the rules. Nobody knew what the rules were. The only time we knew for sure was when someone broke them. I lived quietly, kept my head down, and went about my day like nothing was wrong. But the town felt like a trap, like the air was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. Every time someone broke the law, and it was always something small, something barely noticeable and mundane, they disappeared. I remember the first time I saw it happen. A man I didn't know, even though we lived beside each other for years, took the wrong step. He didn't follow the pattern of the street, the long lines on the roads and footpaths that quietly told everyone where to go. The next morning, his body was hanging in the town square, twisted, broken, like some kind of macabre display. No one looked. No one acknowledged it. The townspeople walked around him like he wasn't there, like it was normal. I started to wonder who was watching, who enforced the rules. There were no police, only strange men in white suits who patrolled the streets. It made you paranoid, made you question every step, every word. You couldn't trust anyone, not even yourself. On the edge of the town, there was a dirt path that everyone ignored. It was there, plain as day, but no one spoke of it, and no one dared follow it. They knew better. I should have known better. I couldn't help myself. The curiosity gnawed at me until I couldn't ignore it anymore. One night, when the streets were dark and the town was asleep, I decided to follow it. The path twisted and turned, snaking away from the town. But no matter how far I walked, I always found myself moving closer to the town. The further I went, the more I felt the town pulling me back, like a black hole dragging me toward its center. The road kept bending in on itself, leading me in circles until finally I ended up right where I started. That's when I knew there was no leaving. The town was alive, and it didn't want me to go. The next day, someone else vanished. A woman this time. She'd broken another rule, whispered something forbidden, something about leaving, and by morning, she was gone. But this time, there was no trace of a body, just her empty house, as if she'd never existed at all. The town knew I was defying it. I could feel it watching me. The more I tried to understand it, the more desperate I was to escape. One night, I saw it. Something that no one should have seen. The clock tower. Its face was always turned away, like it was hiding something, and the townspeople avoided looking at it as if their lives depended on it. I'd followed that rule too at first, but in my growing madness, I dared to glance at it. That's when I saw the truth. The hands of the clock weren't moving. They hadn't moved in years. The town wasn't bound by time. It existed in a liminal space, outside of everything, pulling in those unfortunate enough to stumble upon it. When I first heard the footsteps, I knew then I wasn't just being watched. They were following me wherever I went. I never saw who made them, but they were always there, just behind me, just out of sight. Every corner I turned, they were there, waiting. I knew my time was running out, so I decided to run. I took the road again, and this time I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs gave out, until the town was a blur behind me. And somehow, against all odds, I broke through. I found myself on the other side of the fog, on a highway, cars rushing past me like the world hadn't even noticed I was gone. That's when I started writing this, when I started telling my story. I thought if I warned others, if I could just explain what was waiting out there, I would be safe. I tried hiding in the shadows of my newfound freedom. I had nowhere to go, but I thought if I had nowhere to call home, they wouldn't know where to find me. I've been seeing them again, the terrifying shadows that moved and twisted out of the corners of my eye. As the shadows moved closer, the footsteps got louder, and it was only a matter of time before they found me. I don't know how long I was out. When I woke up, I was strapped to a bed with fluorescent lights burning into my eyes. But I wasn't in a town. I was in a hospital. They told me I'd been there for years, told me I wasn't well, that I had imagined the town, the laws, the people. They said it was a delusion, a paranoid fantasy my mind had constructed to cope with something I didn't want to remember. But they're wrong. The town was real. It is real. I know it. I felt it. They tried to explain it away. They said the people I saw weren't townsfolk, but other patients. The man who was hanging in the streets had managed to escape his room and hanged himself in the common room. The woman who vanished was old and got moved to a more comfortable place. They told me the clock tower was the hospital's old, broken clock, stuck at the same time for years. The road I walked was just a hall leading to the hospital exit. The doctors tried to calm me. They said it's part of my recovery, that my mind is healing, but it's not. They don't understand. They can't. Because the hospital is just another version of the town. The rules are still there, hidden in the routines they force me to follow. The treatments, the schedules, the silence. It's all the same, it's just wearing a different face. I can hear them again, the footsteps, slow and steady, coming down the street. They're getting closer. I know what's coming next. But the terror doesn't end there. Sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that hit closest to home. Seas of Europa. Hot material piped from beneath the rocky underwater surface provided warmth like a mother's womb. At these abyssal, dreary depths of the ocean, the first forms of life evolved without even sunlight present. Little molecules and chemicals freely floated and stitched together, becoming amino acids and proteins and cells, and merging together and becoming plant and animal and eventually human. The ocean gave birth to life and civilization on this earth. It was only reasonable that our next investigation into the origins of life was the nearest ocean in our solar system, Europa, the smallest moon of Jupiter. A frigid world, covered in a layer of ice that extends for kilometers. Beneath all that, however, is the keys for life. A deep ocean extending over 100 kilometers at the darkest depths. Just like on Earth, hydrothermal vents might provide warmth and material for life to form. But when we tried to send probes, even our best antennae could not properly penetrate through the upper layers of ice. That's where you come in. Your mission is to... I zoned out from the training video displayed in my cryopod as I watched the duo dance together outside the vacuum-sealed window. Jupiter and Europa. The creamy, dirt-scarred surface of the latter contrasted with the violent yet puffy clouds of the gas giant standing across the horizon and taking up most of the field of vision. From here, it all seemed to be relatively peaceful. Heaven knows I regret thinking that now. The other pods began to unfreeze along with mine. I was one of the operators of the mining equipment. Drilling past a massive sheet of ice with a hole big enough to fit a submarine is no easy feat. Hold on tight. Landing's going to be a little rough. I remembered astronaut training, the spinning machine to get you accustomed to high G-forces. Yeesh. I clung onto the ladders of my pod as I felt my bones and flesh begin to rattle and jiggle like jelly, but it stopped just as soon as it started. Our pre-designated spot was in a valley where the ice was much thinner. Rock, paper, scissors for who has to put the suit on and get out there, a voice said. And push ice and rocks around all day in a sweaty, smelly suit? Hell no. I'll do it. Really, the drill pod wasn't too bad, aside from the shaking. A metal chair and control center suspended in a room above the excavator to make sure the icy material was properly moving out and operate the equipment. I preferred the solitude anyway. The feeling of the rapid tilt as the drill turned upward was a little nauseating, almost as much as the landing. The tunnel needed to be sloped to allow the submarines to fall through slowly. I got to work excavating, alone with my thoughts. That and the endless feeling of space. The sky looked more white than black with all the stars pockmarked across it. Could it really be that for so long we searched out there when the best candidate might have been literally our next-door neighbor? My thoughts were interrupted as a static sound came through my suit, then a calm. I gritted my teeth. Status report? I opened my camera feed. Little droplets of water began to spit out from the newly formed cave below, tracing along the surface of the drill and being shaken off. I was told I should head back in, the sub's coming out. For the next few hours, as we waited for it to slide down, I was given busy work through the whole outpost. I wandered room to room, setting up hydroponics equipment, scientific instruments, and taking readings. Naturally, my boredom shifted to a sense of anxiety. We were getting close to our goal now. It must have shown on my face because the captain on my team turned to me and asked what I think we'll find down there. I frankly didn't know how to answer him. Could the journey have been for naught, with nothing of meaning down there? Could we be diving off the deep end, releasing something uncontrollable? That hole out there, one of my making, might be the difference between our lives and deaths. I jumped as another comm came through. Subcrew, 100 meters down. We all walked down the long corridors to the view feed room. The monitors showed mostly black with little rays of sunlight poking through the ice, dimming as they went deeper and deeper. 200, 300, 400. They continued to rattle off numbers as the screen went from greenish blue to gray to black. I shivered in my seat a little. The only discernible pattern my human mind could grasp was the subtle static through the screen. The sensory deprivation ceased with some sort of vocalization, a clicking and pulsing sound, guttural like a thick mucus-coated tongue lapping against the palate of the mouth. A distant set of lights emerged again, lighting up in specks, not unlike the stars just above the ice. We normally would have celebrated, but an air of fear settled over the room, a sense that we shouldn't be down here. Our eyes were glued to the screen, yet as the creature approached, echolocation. That's the clicking. There isn't any light down here. How else could it find its way around? He stuttered as a long tentacle reached out, forked over and over like a snake's tongue or the branches of a tree with flat discs across the sides. The viewfinder got cut off as one of them smacked across the front, but the interior lights of the vessel let us peek in. A set of many glowing tongues licked across the surface. Crack, criack, crack. Water pumped in as this enormous hellspawn compressed and bit. This had to be a bad dream. It had to be. I pinched myself over and over trying to zone out the yelling and gasps around me, even raising my arm to my mouth and sinking my teeth into my flesh a little. The camera turned up as the creature let go, with its loud clicks again, rising toward the huge hole we left in the surface. Echolocation. We have to choke it out. Someone turn on the drill. This time, snowball's chance in hell, I was going to volunteer. No way am I going out there. Rock, paper, scissors? Fine. I swore at everything through my suit as I got pushed to the other side of the airlock, out in the vacuum, and with that thing out there. You can do this. Deep breaths. Pushing the lever down, it shook again for a few moments before it stopped and slowed. Red. That was all I saw. Mangled, bloody arms spread across the spiraling surface of the excavator and tunnel. Any relief was short-lived, though, as the flesh started to pulse and throb again, sliding up toward me. I screamed as it approached, and I sped up the ladders from the excavation room back to the airlock. By the time I unsuited, all the windows of the outpost were covered in crawling flesh. For all we knew, our universe was replaced with one where only meat, blood, and fat existed. Tap, tap, tap. Our fate looked to be the same as the one of our waterlogged brethren below. Tap, tap, tap. Some were silently sobbing to themselves. Crack. All our air began to leak out, and that was their cue. A nasty dripping sound came every time more flesh poured in. It wrapped around our legs and spiraled up our bodies, lapping at my own exposed bite mark, tearing into my skin. In my last moments, I could have sworn I heard something from the comm room. This is Mission Control. The next wave of colonists will be landing shortly at your location.